Thanks very much. I want to thank every one of you from the bottom of my heart for being here tonight. I'm always deeply moved by the men and women who somehow overcome the enormous brainwashing and the intimidation that our anti-white system throws at us and still finds their way to a patriotic meeting like this. I know I can speak for the rest of the members of the council and say each and every one of you is deeply appreciated. In the time I have here tonight, I'd like to speak about the sense of discouragement, hopelessness, and despair that our enemies do everything in their power to instill in us, and that sometimes we feel on our own. The deplatforming, doxing, legal persecution, and constant media vilification can take its toll. But we need to remember, negative feelings of this sort are just emotional reactions to the stress and are not rooted in historical facts. I'd like to share some of those facts with you tonight. Facts that I'm certain enemy think tanks are keenly aware of and have factored into their decision to spend as so much political capital to blatantly violate the constitutional rights of millions of decent Americans. At first glance, we may ask, how can we expect to change the course of the United States with its population of 331 million who just elected Joe Biden president? A country under a political system that's totally rigged by international oligarchs and their mercenary lickspittles. But if we carefully examine history, there's cause for optimism. According to historian Robert Calhoun, 40 to 45% of the white population in the 13 colonies supported the Patriots' cause in the American Revolution. Noted historian John E. Furling estimates some 100,000 men served in the Continental Army during the war, and probably twice that number soldiered as militiamen. So we're talking about 300,000 hardcore fighting patriots out of a population of around 2 million whites at the time of the Revolution, or roughly 15.5% of the white population. In 2016, over 50.5 million whites voted for Trump, which was about 54% of the white vote. The equivalent of 15.5% who fought alongside Washington applied to the 50.5 million white Trump voters would be over 7,800,000 dedicated nationalists. But suppose we say that the men of today aren't half the men that they were in 1776. That would still leave us with 4 million revolutionaries. Think about what we could do if we had 1,000 well-disciplined patriotic activists in each state. If we could organize half the percentage of fighters Washington had, we're talking about the equivalent of over 78,000 active nationalists in every state. Now, this obviously isn't an exact science, and there are a lot of variables. There does exist, however, an actual number of our countrymen that can be recruited and organized into our movement, but we can't know for sure what that number is. My point is this: when we see all the treason and degeneracy going on around us, we can sometimes feel overwhelmed and might say to ourselves, how can we ever hope to turn things around? But if we analyze our situation with a historical perspective, we can reasonably have a great deal of hope for the future, hope that our enemies want to kill in us. Someone might say, you can't compare one historical event from 250 years ago to our situation today, even if it is your own country. Well, in June of 2018, the results of a study were released, led by Damon Centola, Associate Professor of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. It showed the power of committed minorities to shift conventional thinking. The study determined that 25% of a total population is all a minority needs to reach the critical mass necessary to reverse a majority viewpoint. And that's what the left has been doing to our country for years, for the last 50 years. The study found 25% is the tipping point, where a determined minority was able to convert anywhere from 72 to 100% of the study groups who had previously been 100% in agreement with their original position. The study made clear it was not about a small elite with disproportionate resources. It was about a determined minority succeeding at challenging the status quo by being unrelenting. When repeatedly exposing the majority to new behavior, they begin to copy it. When a determined minority is able to get 25% of a population to change their thinking and accept the new ideas, the remaining 75 to 100% of the population very quickly comes on board. Before they get to 25%, it is very difficult to get more than 6% of the population to agree with the new ideas. Santola and his researchers called 25% the magic number. This is why our enemies do everything they can to shut us up. They want to be the only ones exposing Americans to their new ideas and their behavior. It took the Jewish left 50 years of slow cultural poisoning to arrive at what we're seeing today in the general population. We have to keep in mind that just below 25% you don't see very much of an effect, which is disheartening to any minority seeking change. They often begin to falter and give up when they're just short of the critical mass. They don't realize the tipping point is just over the horizon. It's like heating water on a stove, and it seems like it's doing nothing, and all of a sudden it breaks out into a boil. They found two things that can work against a committed minority. One was a lack of interaction with other members. And that's why national viewpoints are blacked out and deplatformed to prevent us from interacting with our kinsmen. And two, a competing committed minority, what they called an active resistance. And we have a competing committed competition in the form of well-funded conservative and fake populist hucksters. But even with those obstacles, they found that the tipping point was well below 50%. Certain settings lend themselves to group dynamics. One was the workplace, because people there coordinate with each other and try to adopt a company culture encouraged by a determined minority called management. So when anti-white globo homo terrorists can intimidate corporate leaders, the effect goes right down the line and changes the behavior of every employee. Another place they found the 25% to be particularly effective was online. That's why it's critical for the system to deplatform nationalists from the internet. We were growing by leaps and bounds before Charlottesville, when our ideas were accessible to the general public. After Charlottesville, giant social media companies banished nationalists to our virtual internet ghetto, while at the same time rigging algorithms to fool people into believing everybody is on board with the Black Lives Matter Antifa agenda. The research also showed that a bot is very effective at standing in for a real person and can actually drive change while being indistinguishable from people. You can bet that's exactly what Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others are doing. Yale sociologist Emily Erkson said that the research was a warning and commented, quote, "In some sense, it's saying extreme voices can quickly take over public discourse. Perhaps if we're aware of that fact, we can guard against it," unquote. So why should racial nationalists feel good about any of this? certainly not because the system is using all of this against us. We can, however, feel good about having this knowledge ourselves and knowing that they've only been able to hamper our efforts and slow us down, but they haven't stopped us. We're still growing. We're still growing, and that magic number is there for us too. In addition to that, most of what we preach is not a minority viewpoint. In their hearts, average Trump voters believe most of what we believe. In April of 2020, Erica Chenoweth, a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, along with others, released a paper titled Questions, Answers, and Some Cautionary Updates Regarding the 3.5% Rule. They explained the 3.5% rule refers to the claim that no government has withstood a challenge of 3.5% of its population mobilized against it during a peak event. A peak event being the number of people at the largest reported event, like a protest, skirmish, a battle, a strike, or in a campaign, or during a campaign. They're not talking about the cumulative number of participants over the course of a campaign. This rule builds on insight that political scientist Mark Litvak developed in his 1995 book, The Rebel's Dilemma. Litvak speculates that A, no government could withstand a challenge of 5% of the population, and B, no rebellion could hope to mobilize more than 5% of the population anyway, because of popular incentives to free ride on more risk-acceptant revolutionaries. And once again, that's what conservative and civic nationalists provide, a more risk-acceptant alternatives to a meaningful fight. They go on to say the 3.5% metric is a rule of thumb in most cases, but does not account for other factors, such as momentum, organization, strategic leadership, and sustainability. Those factors are probably as important as large-scale participation in achieving movement success, and are often precursors to achieving a 3.5% participation. They documented 323 nonviolent and violent mass mobilizations from 1900 to 2006, 323, that were seeking to topple national governments or achieve territorial self-determination. So we're talking about major change here, not talking about reforms. They found three major reasons why only 3.5% of the population was able to achieve maximalist change: disruption, public sympathy and support, and defections. A determined minority of that size is able to disrupt the status quo, tank an economy, shut down cities and neighborhoods, and supply massive political pressure on leaders. If a movement can mobilize 3.5% of the population to participate, it's likely the tip of an iceberg with much more support in the general population. That wider support can grow into political pressure for establishment figures to leave office, even under dictatorships. The third thing that happens is defections on the government side. People in economics, business, politics, cultural institutions, and the media stop supporting the status quo, and some of them join the movement. This usually happens when a movement reaches a critical mass and creates a sense of inevitability about its success. These figures relied only on peak participation, not cumulative participation. The 3.5% rule doesn't account for participation built over time. A slower cumulative effect appeared to be a better predictor of success than raw numbers at a peak event, due to the way populations react to continuous, large-scale, and expanding movement activity. In fact, ignoring wider support and just bringing large numbers of people to the streets may create a vocal but unpopular minority without any permanent victory. Campaigns that mobilize between 0.06 and 1% of the population had over a 45% success rate in this study of over 300 revolutions since 1900. You talk about a very small percentage of the population. The longer-lasting nonviolent revolutions tended to create more durable results in the aftermath because longer-lasting nonviolent uprisings have to develop more of a complex organizational capacity and infrastructure, which facilitates better institution building in the long run. So you can see that the level of support we need for victory is doable. Our enemies see that too, and that's the reason for their panicking, even when we sometimes feel like we're insignificant.
Yeah.
Our enemies understand our potential better than we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we get to that magic number? We won't do it if we're chained to the Republican Party. Yeah. We won't do it if we're chained to the Republican Party, conservatives, or phony populists. By always talking about the symptoms of our problems and never talking about the cause, they're never able to build a unified movement beyond an election or the next appeal for financial donations. Even if they're sincere, their rhetoric about smaller government, less taxes, law and order, and traditional values is easily co-opted by establishment shills. In addition to that, conservatives are weak and ineffective against anti-white, hate-filled anarchist mobs in the streets. And their liberal and corporate allies. We need to organize around real, uncompromising demands. Demands that can't be hijacked by bad actors or dropped by lying politicians the day after an election. We can reach that magic number and launch a national renaissance when patriots straighten out their thinking, get disciplined, persevere, and quit falling for the same lies. The populist impulse in this country is huge and manifests itself every decade or so. In 1968, George Wallace made a third-party bid for president. The American Independent Party was a populist, states' rights, civic nationalist party. Wallace was well known as a racial segregationist from his days as governor of Alabama. In mid-September of 1968, polls showed that 1 in 3 union members, this is a time when unions were still big, 1 in 3 union members supported Wallace, and he had support from 44% of white steel workers in Chicago. He was leading the three-way race in the South with 45% of the vote. By November, fearing the election of liberal Democrat Hubert Humphrey, many of Wallace's less fanatical supporters ended up voting for Nixon, with a more respectable conservative, so-called, and a Republican. Wallace ended up receiving 13.5% of the popular vote and 46 electoral votes carrying 5 southern states. No third-party candidate has won more than 1 electoral vote since then. Had Wallace won South Carolina or Tennessee, which he lost by less than 50,000 votes, and had the Democratic ticket won either Illinois or Ohio, each of which they lost by only 100,000 votes, Nixon would have ended up with a plurality, but not a majority, and the election would have been thrown into the House of Representatives for the first time since 1824. 4 years later, on January 13, 1972, Wallace declared himself a Democratic candidate. Then, on May 15th, with high ratings in the polls, Wallace was shot 5 times while campaigning in Laurel, Maryland. Although he remained in politics, voter concern about his health and the media portraying him as nearly helpless effectively ended his career. And his supporters at the time pointed out, he was in a wheelchair. His supporters pointed out that they never said that about Roosevelt. After Wallace, the American Independent Party ran occasional congressional and gubernatorial candidates, but had no real impact. They basically became constitutionalists and stayed away from overtly racial politics. In 2020, they ran a businessman for president. He received 60,000 votes in the whole country. So Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. And on February 10th of 1972, he had a recorded chat with Billy Graham, one of the most influential Christian leaders of the 20th century. In 2008, by the way, Graham's estimated lifetime audience, including radio and television broadcasts, was over 2.2 billion. Now, during that chat, they talked about the Jews. Nixon had said, Washington, quote, is full of Jews, unquote. And that, quote, most Jews are disloyal, unquote. He made exceptions for some of his top aides, but he said, quote, generally speaking, you can't trust the bastards. They turn on you, unquote. Graham responded saying, quote, this stranglehold has got to be broken or the country is going down the drain, unquote. You believe that, Nixon asked? Yes, sir, said Graham. Oh boy, replied Nixon, so do I.
What did they do about it? What did you do about it?
He says, oh boy, replied Nixon, so do I. I can't ever say that, but I believe it. Graham replied, no, but if you're elected a second time, then we might be able to do something.
Yeah, right. We've heard it before. Yeah.
Then Graham talked about friends of his in the press who were Jewish and how they, quote, swarm around me and are friendly to me, unquote, but added, they don't know how I really feel about what they're doing to this country.
Why didn't you tell them?
They went on to talk about the influence of Jews in Hollywood and the press and how they were promoters of pornography. Think about it. A sitting president afraid to talk publicly about a known threat to the nation. But they did nothing about the Jewish stranglehold on our country that they talked about. They kicked the can down the road, and here we are today. How many conservatives, religious leaders, and elected officials today know about the stranglehold of the Jews over the nerve centers of our country and are still kicking the can down the road? Did Nixon and Graham think it would be easier to fix the problem in 2021 than it was in 1972? Do those who know what the problem is today think it will be easier to solve in 2070? No! The requirements to secure a future for our children will become more unpleasant with each passing year for everybody involved. In 1992, businessman Ross Perot ran another colorful third-party populist campaign for president. In June of that year, Perot led a Gallup poll with 39% of the vote. After briefly dropping out and re-entering the campaign, his support fell, but he still received 19% of the popular vote. He got almost 20 million votes, but no electoral college votes, making him the most successful third-party presidential candidate in terms of popular vote since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. He cost Bush Sr. a second term, and Bill Clinton became president. Then in 2000, Pat Buchanan, after a bitter nomination struggle, ran on Perot's Reform Party ticket. Donald Trump was actually toying with the idea of securing that nomination. That's when Trump learned about the enthusiasm and vigor of nationalists and populists that flocked into the Buchanan brigades, as we were called. Buchanan promised his followers that he would at least leave behind a genuine nationalist party after the election. State party organizations emerged in every state. The idea was to build those state party organizations over the next 4 years and become way more formidable by 2004. After he qualified for the $12 million federal dollars Perot's party had coming to it, Buchanan selected a black female school teacher for his running mate. And he ran a token campaign so as to not help elect Democrat Al Gore. That gave the election to George W. Bush in a very close race. Buchanan is a guy who is more loyal to institutions like the Republican Party and the Catholic Church than he is to any idea or cause. He spent about $1 million of the $12 million paying his campaign cronies very well and purchasing goofy yard signs from a printing company his sister Bane was connected with. Who knows what happened to the other $11 million? The majority of his supporters were disheartened by his vice presidential pick. In November, he finished fourth with a little under 500,000 votes, or 0.4% of the popular vote. After 2002, he disappeared from the Reform Party scene, which descended into factions and infighting with no relevancy today. After that, it took Trump about 15 years to make his move. To the outrage of establishment Republicans, Trump tapped that undervalued asset of nationalist populist spirit he discovered in 2000. He won the presidency in 2016 and continued to mouth the rhetoric that got him elected while pursuing the typical GOP agenda of tax breaks for the super rich and blank checks for Israel. We all know what happened from there. It should be painfully obvious by now that organizing around colorful political figures alone or around outdated conservative talking points gets us nowhere. Being against the liberal left is not enough. Every effort at organizing along those lines has ended in failure, betrayal, or both. The system understands the value of letting the Indians whoop and holler it up on the reservation. It siphons off patriotic funds and energy that might otherwise go to hostiles that are off the reservation. That's what they fear. Do the conservatives and civic nationalists of today really believe they can be more successful than George Wallace, Richard Nixon, Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, or Donald Trump?
They're phonies.
Coming close to or even winning or making it to the White House with a useless, impotent political platform has achieved nothing that needs to be done. Conditions have become progressively worse for the past 60 years. Even when they make it to the top, conservatives and civic nationalists have no political mandate to tackle our racial problems or the Jewish stranglehold on our nation. Without solving those problems, everything else is useless. Our fight is not with nationalists of other races. I'm currently reading a book it's published in 1992. It's titled In the Spirit of Crazy Horse by Peter Matheson. It's about the FBI's war on the American Indian movement. And there's another book, it's hard to find at a reasonable price. It's titled Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret Wars Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement. That's by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall. You can see the similarities with the FBI's war on white nationalism today. Oligarchs encouraged white racial feelings when they needed to extract every last dime out of Indian lands or harness black slaves. Today they encourage their former victims to tear down white nations in order to clear the way for their global plantation of mindless consumers and raceless wage slaves. It wasn't white nationalists who brought African slaves to North America. It wasn't white nationalists who broke treaties and forced Indian children to cut their hair, wear Western clothes, and abandon their culture. These policies were implemented by white capitalists and their Jewish cohorts, people who always put profits above culture and tradition, no matter who they're dealing with. Yes, when it suited them, they used white racial feelings against other groups, but that's done with now. They have since decided that crushing white culture, white tradition, and white nations is the best way to serve their economic and political interests. I'm confident we can eventually negotiate equitable agreements with nationalist leaders of other races to allow for the self-determination of every people. Our fight is with those who say, for whatever reason, white people, you will not secure sovereignty and self-determination for your people. Not in America, not in Europe, not in Australia, Southern Africa, or anywhere else. You must tear down your monuments, vilify your ancestors, and instill guilt in your children. The people who preach and advocate these things, the short-sighted, greedy capitalists, born Bolsheviks, anti-white haters, and the political whores who serve them, that's who our fight is with. And they will have a fight. I'll end with two things. The first is a message for careerist judges, prosecutors, and police who more and more are violating their oaths of office to uphold the Constitution by infringing upon the rights of patriotic Americans to speak, assemble, and defend themselves against violent attacks by leftist anti-white street thugs. History has shown that the political climate can change overnight. 75 years ago, the neoliberal system you serve set the precedent that I was just following orders is not a defense. The day is rapidly approaching when your choice to either uphold your oath of office or to serve the anti-American forces that have seized control of our nation's institution will have permanent personal consequences. If you cannot uphold your legal and moral duty in the office you currently serve, resign and seek some kind of honest employment. Go to truck driving school. Second, to the men and women who have joined and will join this struggle for our racial and cultural existence, I'll say this. In 1948, while Europe lay in ruins from the combined forces of international communism, capitalism, and Jewry, Francis Parker Yockey wrote this: "The West has 2 centuries and tens of millions of lives of the coming generations to give to the war against the barbarian and the distorter. It has a will which has not only emerged unbroken from the Second World War, but is now more articulate all over Europe, and it's gaining in strength with every year, every decade. Merely material superiority will do them little good in a war whose duration will be measured, if necessary, in centuries. Napoleon knew, and the West still knows, the primacy of the spiritual in warfare. The soil of Europe, rendered sacred by the streams of blood which have made it spiritually fertile for a millennium, will once again stream with blood until the barbarians and distorters have been driven out and the Western banner waves on its home soil from Gibraltar to North Cape and from the rocky promontories of Galloway to the Urals." Yockey goes on, he says, "This is promised not by human resolves merely, but by a higher destiny, which cares little whether it is 1950, 2000, or 2050. This destiny does not tire, nor can it be broken, and its mantle of strength descends upon those in its service." Thank you.